Hello everyone, today we talk about Gregory VII in person, right? We talked so much about the Gregorian reforms, but hardly ever focused on the guy. We do not look today at his history as such, but mostly at his thought, and especially that the historiographical criticism has been made regarding the idea of Gregory, in fact, having been the, say, in absolute terms, like the most important pontiff to have, in fact, achieved what have been, in fact, even called in his names the Gregorian reforms. All right. So this is not even the video in which we analyze just the historiographical side of the story. We will be reading some of his, let's say, works and confront them with the ones, especially of Humbert of Silva Candida, and partly also Peter Damian. About the latter, we made a video a couple of months ago explaining, what was the deal already in that generation before that inspired Gregory, having, really started that broader process of Reformation, where later popes like Pascal II, Alexander III, the same Urban II, right, the launcher, let's say, of the First Crusade. I know it sounds somehow bad to define him that way, but you know what I'm talking about. And so there is the great problem: where did Gregory also got his ideology from? And whether this was original, what did he add to that, and how? Let's say immediately, why was his pontificate so important? Because there is no doubt that he may have not been, again, the Pope who succeeded in affirming for good the papal monarchy. This is the point, right? At his death in exile in southern Italy, he was essentially experimenting a failure, and at his death, it seemed like things would have come back as before. That he is Hildebrand of Soana, his lay name had been the guy who confronted Henry IV to objectively an unprecedented level of escalation and of actual impact, like in the say universal policy. We're not talking just the Holy Roman Empire, but the Byzantines. Right, so an enormous, gigantic figure, but that must be contextualized and mostly appreciated, if anything, for the vehemency, like the actual action that he took in order to make the reform succeed. And the reform, as we were pointing out before, was not a novelty, right? This had already been starting, and overall, aside from the concept of reform proper, the let's say the general development of the papacy, of the empire, was obvious at this point in history. Western civilization was booming, right? So actually the better term is Gregorian reforms, exactly to stress the fact that it was like a gradual work. Excuse me, I drink a little already at the beginning, and not just one single contribution by a single pope, even though Gregory really seemed like the leader. And there are valid reasons for thinking of his work to have been central in the investiture controversy, because that's, at the end of the day, what the entire thing revolved around. The Dictatus Papae is possibly the most important document that you have to quote in, let's say, speaking of the reforms, even though this was to contextualize among the various works of this of Gregory have been just found, and that eventually given importance by historiography, and therefore to be understood only in a specific context. So buckle your belts, because it's going to be a rough ride, in the sense we'll be citing a lot of mostly letters by Gregory, also the one of other figures, as we were saying before, including the emperors, like responding. etc. And there is a playlist dedicated to the Gregorian reforms plus like to medieval Christianity that makes you see a lot like what the entire deal of, for example, the Pataria, right? The instances of religious renewal and reform were already, and especially in the first half of the 11th century, how this problem also of the investitures was really ongoing since Roman times, since Carolingian times. And so this had to be settled in a time in history in which institutions become more robust in the Latin Germanic world. And so also the papacy fundamentally starts finding its place from, by the way, on top of an incredibly prestigious position, right? We should recover that sense of Roman primacy from a very old time, not just properly the foundation of the Roman Church, but what this had meant throughout the entire early Middle Ages. But somehow we think that, I don't know, even the links between the Pope and the Franks, and in fact the later reform, said, well, were something, at some point they happen for no reason. Actually, there is a great continuity in the Roman papal legacy of Catholic tradition that came straight out of the Roman holiness in the empire as the center of the world. And this is yet a thing that, we are not told more than much, because we are mostly describing what was going on at the time, but like the more sort of look towards the past and what this original meanings were about, meanings, beliefs, right, are often like, okay, the guy who talks about ancient history will tell me, right, and I don't do it because I'm a medievalist. This is the kind of prevalent mentality that unfortunately does not quite help. But again, it's going to be a pretty long video, so let's go at it, all right. Again, the influence of the earlier years, right? There is a paradox in the Gregorian reforms, that is the dialectic, the general purpose of the reforms of the church had been started by the same empire. So the one that the Gregorian reforms would react against. Not because they didn't want to purify the church, but quite because, in fact, that excuse had been used by the emperors to de facto starting electing ecclesiastical officials, which was a very important way, it's a very convenient way indeed of governing, especially since Ottonian times. And it was also very close to the Byzantine concept of rule, right? There is a connection there. We'll see also the Byzantine influence in the Ottonian concept of the empire. But that objectively interfered with not just the autonomy, but the independence of the church, right? Which was an enormous issue because of the ultimate problem that we have been discussing also for the had always existed in ancient times. It sort of died out a bit in the early Middle Ages because things were less dynamic, but it pops up prepotently this time, together, for example, with heresies, etc., regarding the worthiness, like the fitness and the purity of the same church, right? Is a church whose officials are elected by a lay authority actually, pious, holy, right? In its purpose, this was really the ultimate question. Remember that the church does not belong to the world in the first place, and that the entire ecclesiastical tradition had been the one of election of power, so that even if, of course, this still went on, it had never ended. Like, this had turned into a fiction for which the emperors, the kings, decided which prelate had to be elected in this non-dynastic context like the ecclesiastical one is. And so that would help dramatically boosting the state, and the church, of course, would keep supporting, even in a sense, during the investiture controversy and after, always the empire, and vice versa. Like, it's not that these two powers divorced or fractured or were against one another. It was all about the worthiness, the fitness of the officials, even the highest ones, the Pope and the Emperor. So there had been a phase in which this, say, corruption of the church through delay investitures had been apparent, like the so-called phase, for example, of the German papacy between 1046 and 1057. Also, the Lotharingian Burgundian one between 1057 and 1073 had been quite eloquent, but there had been like a general consensus about the necessity of disciplining the clergy, right, from all sides. Again, the emperors themselves had intervened in this sense to pick the best ones, right? They weren't appointing their own officials by saying, okay, well, this is the anti-reformistic thing. On the contrary, no, we must purify. Like the Gregorian reforms take the same dialectic that the Ottonians used. We have to choose the best guys, right, because the church deserves that, right? And so the concept that the law had to be against simony and clerical marriage, for example. So essentially having the purchasing of the offices, and the tendency to, as it happened in parallel to in the lay world from which the bishops also came from, like in terms of background, etc., to dynastization, to also legitimate children, was out there, and a problem. Also, the church was becoming ever bigger. The Roman Church had really been scoring massive continental-wide and beyond successes in terms of the evangelization of Europe, of different peoples. At the beginning of the 11th century, think about Sylvester II, like the conversion of Poland, of Hungary, the Great Schism, that had actually would play an enormous role in the definition of the Gregorian reforms. We think this to have been just, it's the Pope clashing against the Emperor in the West, right? Not quite. This is the reaffirmation of Roman primacy also within what was still considered the Empire, right? The popes especially saw the Byzantine and the Holy Roman Empire as actually, as it would obviously be just a single Roman Empire, like a bit not like the Western half, Western and Eastern half, or something like that. And of course, the concept of empire was unitary, even if this has been sort of secularistically and modernistically being sort of distant from our thoughts. The same goes for the schism. Like, it's not that at the moment of the Great Schism in the mid-11th century, somebody established that there would be a Roman Catholic Church and a sort of, Greek Orthodox one. Like, this is just a completely modernistic, secularistic categorization. It has nothing to do with anything that we're doing or thinking or identifying with at the time. As a matter of fact, the same Orthodox Church today is called Catholic for obvious reasons. And so we should recover that sense of true Catholic tradition, in fact, according to the most also pre-Christian belief of Catholicism. Now, there had been already some pretty messed up situations. For example, the anti-Pope Clement III, the famous Wibert, right, had already signified the will by those who had supported him to restore, for example, the papal imperial cooperation in ecclesiastical reform. That was a way to essentially support further the imperial agenda in that side of the aisle, because some reformers thought that still the reform had to happen, but through the most recent political means, right? We're in the time of Henry III, who's Holy Roman Emperor. In 1105, so we are after, after Gregory's pontificate, we are between 1073 and 1085. Like in 1105, Henry IV, that was just 2 years away from resignation, looked back nostalgically to that time of peace and harmony that historically had been concede, at least in this imperial mindset, he would write in a letter, Pax et concordia que inter nos etiam et Nicolaum et Alexandrum, here Nicholas II and Alexander II, viros, popes, right? Viros catholicos et religiosus Romanos pontifices, right? Would thinking of them as the gold standard. Once upon a time, we emperors could really control the papacy to that extent, right? Gregory VII's pontificate marks instead the end of that, right? As we just said, 1073. After which, according to the emperor, Gregory VII and Urban II magis videbantur nos persequi odio et indignatione quam zelo justitiae. That is to say, they would persecute literally the imperial authority out of true hatred, rage, rather than like a true, zeal towards justice, towards righteousness, right? And this is the Holy Roman Imperial version of the story, right? The Gregorians were seeing that the previous period as essentially a moment of servitude and not of partnership with the empire, right, from the papal side, and that they had managed to break by essentially fighting for the freedom of the church from the same empire. We'll see on which terms, on which premises, and how primarily the empire, in their view, had failed, right, in pursuing the, say, righteousness and justice, right? So there is no doubt that Gregory VII, marks a watershed in the history of the church, in the history of the empire of the West, right? And that exactly in his pontificate, the two factions between the papalists and imperialists, we can so say, would be more neatly outlined. And as a note, I always add that this dichotomy actually helped dramatically the development of Western civilization in the best possible way, because it had a dichotomy, a dialogue, right, a challenge between these two systems, right? Otherwise, like, the other path would have been essentially a Byzantine one, one like in the older times, in which, well, in Christian times, it was not really possible conceptually, as we said before. The church does not belong to earth, but the idea was that the emperor should have been at the head of the church, appointing, in fact, even popes, right, or even killing them, like it had been the Byzantine case. And this would have sclerotized the political dialectic within Europe. We have not had a sense of participation, of, let's say, of conscience, objection. The truest and best of the Christian Catholic tradition flowed, like in the Western veins, thanks to this struggle, thanks to this constant challenge, like the sheer scale of civilizational output that came out of this in terms of legal, theological, even in terms of actual, but both canonic and say lay words we're talking here, but also simply politics and even warfare and more. Like, you could have not really had the properly the revitalization of so much artistry and wealth if this constant effort and definition of identities and political power had not occurred as a consequence of the investiture controversy. So it would be interesting to talk more about the historiographical version of the story. It is true that Gregory was seen since the times as a bit like the symbol of the struggle. And this is the point. It was about the struggle in itself, not the fact, as we will learn now, that what Gregory had come up was new or say revolutionary in a conceptual way. It had always been there. It was, if you want, inherent to the greatly unsolved question, right? That started since Constantine regarding the prerogatives of the lay in the ecclesiastical authority, right? You have even an opponent of Gregory VII, as you'll see now, that is Schwerpunkt of Jean Blou in the Epistola Laodicensium number 10, that says how Hildebrand, so Gregory Hildebrand of Savana is a place in southern Tuscany where the guy was originally from. There is still the house where he was born, interestingly, this medieval town. And he was, according to Schwerpunkt, the first who girded himself with the sword of war against the emperor. This is another aspect that really impressed the contemporaries. The fact that these factions had been instigating one another, and especially the papacy had literally enacted those threats, like probably of violence, stemming from the rebellion, like of the faithful, to the, in fact, the unrighteousness of particular prelates that were also, again, they had military clienteles, they ruled, they had that level of power, but that had been appointed by the emperor, in part exactly because of that. And as such, it was legitimate to resist to. And it's not, again, that these ideas had been new, that Gregory had created them out of scratch, right? That this whole thing, we discussed it often in the videos about the Gregorian reforms, revolved mostly around the great diocese of northern Italy, right? They were connected with the rights of the Holy Roman Emperors as such, because the Italic crown was necessary for the Roman papal crowning. Since Charlemagne, but mostly again under the Ottonians, the bishops' counts had played that crucial role, having the Germans passing through northern Italy to reach the Urbs. And the struggle would take place there, just like it later would happen, in part as a consequence of this, during the Wars of the Lombard League, right? That was sponsored by the papacy against the Germanic emperors. So the centrality of the role of Gregory VII has thus come a bit to uncritically, like, into the modern historiography, right? And this started, as we've seen, immediately during the Middle Ages. It's, however, during the modern age that both for confessional and philological reasons, like the figure of Gregory VII was resumed, right? Because the Protestants in early modern Europe began to attack Gregory as a sort of malignant figure in the bad Catholic guise of the papal monarch against the council of the bishops, so this idea of hierarchy that the Protestants were contesting at the time. In fact, there were authors like Bibliander who literally said that Gregory had been more wicked than Emperor Nero, in spite of the fact that up to that point by the Church had been lauded as the best of the popes. Right, so this triggered, as a consequence, like in the age of print, of like a much wider circulation and a completely different spiritual temper from half of a millennium before, a vivacious debate around Gregory that sort of lived in the veins of the later modern contemporary historiography. The most important work on Gregory sort of informed our concept of the Gregorian reform, singular, that was coined, in fact, by this author, is the one of Augustin Flich, who was actually defending Gregory, and that in his narrative, in his phraseology, began to distinguish historically, chronologically, between the pre-Gregorians, the post-Gregorians, the anti-Gregorian opposition, etc. And Flisch again exalts Gregory against especially the 16th, 17th century Protestants, so that the guy becomes like a symbol, an archetype of humility, of resignation, of charity, love, peace, and justice. And so Flisch's Gregorian reform remains central in our language, in our view of that phase of history, and as many other names, just like when you think about the Byzantine Empire, right? That I defend the concept of, say, no harm done when you say the word Byzantine, because for all the times I heard someone complaining about this and not knowing literally anything about Byzantine history, like at a manualistic level, I would be richer than I am. Let's put it this way, consistently so. And the same goes a bit with the Gregorian reforms. I mean, it's just a term that again has entered our language historiographically, and it's kind of okay just to nickname like that, because what other term? It's just a conventional one. It's fine, right? If Gregory was not literally the Pope who decided that the papal monarchy, the entire process of reform, like, who cares, right? Still, he was a very important guy, so in the same dynamics of why not still honoring him with that historiographical definition. This historiographical conception also generated further simplification of the Gregorian, in fact, reform, singular, as if Gregory had started with this input and then basically just some technocrats of theocracy down the line, the ecclesiastical machine had just enacted them and provided just to organize themselves accordingly. And naturally, just even from a conceptual point of view, this is not how really a medieval system works. The church, don't get me wrong, and I always stress that, had a shocking, capacity to mold a real monarchy, and this with an incredible juridical, theological, administrative, bureaucratic capacity and achievement. They really saved Western Europe, that was about to collapse in that sense from the heretical formations that had been proliferating without a single head, would have engulfed the continent into a freaking mess. It was convincing, right? The entire, so even just what is fascinating about the same heresies is that hardly any of them were actually contesting the necessity of Rome as a center of the church. This is incredibly important because the Protestant historiography mostly was complaining about that. But if you look at the time, nobody was saying like just the popes shouldn't be the heads of the church. People were just asking for not just the heretics, but the paparistic evangelical movements, those heterodox, masses, just for the Pope has to be better, and it must be Rome. We want Rome. We want a head. We want a chief. We want an organization of that kind. And it was autonomously asked for, right? And the Roman Church had always sort of covered that role to some degree, and quite powerful one, even before the papal monarchy, as was pointing out before. In fact, a system without a unified state or a single, even just lay rule or whatever. But that axis, especially between Italy, Gaul, Britain, great part of Germany, it already in the early Middle Ages had been established, had been quite consolidated. Now, the way the Gregorian reforms came to happen, however, was much more gradual, right? And it's important to stress again that ideologically, there is really not such, like in the actual contents of the reform, a divide between the pre-Gregorian and the Gregorian, post-Gregorian phase, right? The church was surely accelerating in its compaction. It was in its hierarchization and general power. So that there are differences, but the fundamental premises were the same, right? There could be popes that also had sort of different ideas. People went as far as saying that Gregory was the only one who actually had the beliefs that we associate with what we call the Gregorian reforms, which is a bit too cerebral as an issue as well. But it's really the struggle that makes the difference. So much so that, again, at Gregory's death, it seemed like things would have sort of come back as before, like those ideas would have remained, because they had already been existing from before, from before Gregory, but nobody had the courage to act on them, like contrasting the emperor, excommunicating him, going literally to open warfare with him. And this was clamorous enough, right? We can observe that, again, later popes were also more influent than him at strictly also ideological level, like in the theoretical production and framing and consolidation of the reforms ideas, right? Think what happened later with, the Crusades. Lots of things were changing at so many different levels, and it made, again, other videos sort of overlapping with this topic, like, for example, the one about the Holy War and how this had already been existing and gradually, in fact, the Crusades did not begin with 1095, nor it makes sense to call the Crusades exclusively per se as, say, religious wars, given that every single war at the time fought by literally any person was exclusively about God and religion, and in the name of God. There is no difference whatsoever. What actually, as always, matters is what was happening at a higher level, that is to say, a pope literally waging war with say his own divisions, right? Sent even without the control of the great monarchs of the time, to even succeed in recovering Jerusalem, right? Which is insane just per se, right? That this is much more important by far than anything you have ever heard, mostly in a liberal anti-Christian rhetoric that is, oh my God, the Crusades were invented, what a terrible thing. As if, any other people in the world had literally not been doing this since ever, right? And just by everybody's understanding and definition of the time. This is utterly insane for the level of radical cultural, personal, and moral inferiority of modern people, for just the way they can make themselves believe pure falsity without any intellectual scruple whatsoever. Now, certainly Gregory VII did not add that original touch to the contents of the reforming theory, right? He was definitely not, he was a medium of concepts that had already been obviously around for the practical and the theoretical obviousness of what the issue was between the papacy and the empire had to be settled sooner or later, that already other figures had been struggling for, right? So it's better to frame Gregory as a continuator of a papal reform that had already been launched effectively since the mid-11th century. That, as we've seen, is not easy to categorize itself, but it had been a matter of true universal relevance because it had been guided by the same imperial institutions. The Pope and the Emperor were responsible for that ultimately, since ever. Gregory was really complaining in his decrees against simony and clerical marriage pretty much in the same way it had been going on from prior generation. Especially he loved the work of Pope Leo IX. We are in the first half of the 11th century. He was really obsequious towards him. He called him our father. He had been himself with Leo IX when the Pope was coming back from the German exile to Rome in 1049. So Hildebrand had been quite impressed by this individual, and Gregory would in fact keep spreading also during his pontificate anecdotes about Leo IX, given that again he had been with him, and he scolded some followers of his members of his entourage for having failed to record Leo IX's achievements. Gregory provided the very important figures, such as the abbot of Monte Cassino Desiderius and Bruno of Segni, right? A very important bishop of Latium. I made a video about medieval Lazio, by the way, that you can look at to understand the work of the suburbicarian sees that were crucial really in fostering the generation of the reformers in this context, with information that had to be essentially just stored and presented, like stressing the sanctity of Leo IX. This is present really in, for example, Desiderius' Dialogi de Miraculis Sancti Benedicti, in the aforementioned Bruno of Segni's Libellus de Simoniacis. You can find all these sources in the Monumenta Germania Historica, by the way. Obviously enough, very central to Gregory's ecclesiological view was the centrality of the Roman Church, so what would become the papal monarchy. The idea that the Church had only one head, and that this was the Roman one, that was properly a corporatistic unity, a single body, and that the Roman one encompassed this, right, as the mother mistress of all churches, right? Literally, this is sanct in the. This was a concept that he had been expressed, at least in the name of Leo the Ninth, right? And that probably had to do with the previous work of the important Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, as we'll see now, one of the greatest, let's say, thinkers like of the Reform. In fact, in the previous generation, this text reported the Sancta Ecclesia caput totumque corpus. In Gregory's, say, letters, like single letters, we find in the 54th, Sanctamque Romanam Ecclesiam omnium ecclesiarum matrem et magistram. So the concept is crystalline, and it had already been around for quite a while. Actually, the Roman primacy of honor and charity had always been there since Roman times. Like properly, the Byzantines themselves had never been able to claim anything against that, like from Constantinople. And let's remember that Humbert of Silva Candida was the same guy who was communicated the Archbishop of the Patriarch of Constantinople as like Michael Cerularius, right? And that I can't say what, but that was a way of like conceiving the Roman Church that had to do with the empire as a whole, and against, in that case, properly like a might like to be reckoned with, like the Byzantine one still was in Italy at that point. So also interacting with the papacy. And so with all an issue, what happens here with the Normans that arrive and that the popes first try to fight and then eventually give permission to settle, like to keep also the Byzantines away and just to have some bodyguards against the Germans that, especially during the reforms, had not liked very much what the Pope was up to in that sense. So it's all that complicated. It doesn't stem from some whim. It's literally universal politics. And we will see perhaps better in other videos how everything falls into place in this context. As we were saying, the most important work in this way by Gregory, the Dictatus Papae of March 1075, is central. It's 27 sentences. You can easily read it also in translation if you prefer, but they're very simple sentences that basically tell that, to make long story short, the Roman Church can decide literally everything, right? What the emperor can do or can't do, that the ultimate authority was the popes in all moral matters, because that was the ultimate vicariate of Christ on earth, and there was literally no other force that could supersede it. Like, this was probably a prophecy. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church. This survey is found in the register that part we cited just before, and it's not really like we even know exactly how this document was used. So you see, it became sort of historiographical, at least the manifesto of the Gregorian reforms, but this was just like a set of ideas and claims that surely were employed in some way that surely derived from... There is a bit of originality by Gregory in this, right? Because it's like an incredibly pushed sort of interpretation or misinterpretation, even, and surely exaggeration of canonical sources, but it sort of makes sense in a broader theological and metaphysical way, and that, was the ultimate position of the papacy, and it is still true today by the magisterium of the Catholic Church. And that, however, has a very interesting context, which has a lot to do with the aforementioned clash with not much just the Holy Roman Emperor, but with the Byzantines, right? And this Dictatus has actually a lot to do with rhetoric that was already around since Leo IX's time, and specifically the one of the negotiations with Constantinople about the vexata quaestio, in fact, of the aforementioned recognition of the Roman primacy, which had brought the Cardinal Umbert of Silva Candida to go to Constantinople to excommunicate the Patriarch in 1053, and that therefore was a powerfully clamorous statement that we sort of tend to underestimate for saying how close still the Roman Church was to the Byzantine Empire at this point, how they literally thought that they were controlling east and west from Rome, and keeping at bay both heads, which is sort of like extremely telling about the confidence of the Roman papacy by that point, right? There are some thoughts evidently connected with the Dictatus that derive from the Constitutum Constantini. I made a video about the false donation that, however, was also discovered, so by the way, for, let's say, for clarity, by a papal philologist like Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century. It's not even to say the church is trying to obscure things like the Constantine's donation document has a very interesting history back in the day, and is very unrelated to what was going on at this point in a, say, close sense, but it had been produced for other reasons. It has to do also just for the way canonic sources were produced at the time, and not necessarily in Rome. In fact, it's essentially a French thing, but the Pope had accepted as true also because, the means to do so were different back from, say, the times of humanistic history. And that served the purpose. So that was used as source also by Gregory. Excuse me, I drink a little bit once again. Today I ate a bit too much pizza, so I'm a bit thirsty. There was in all this also a Byzantine influence on the Gregorian content, meaning, for example, to humiliate the same Byzantines. I mean, the fact that you owed the proskynuses to the Pope, that this was a thing like from, say, the Persians, that Alexander had introduced, that to stress properly the divinity of the rule, like, so you had to kiss the feet of the Pope, this kind of stuff, and there is all a bibliography about this, but it's surely all connected with the great so-called Great Schism, and so the clear, unequivocal international affirmation of the papacy, like showing a giant middle finger to Constantinople for good, like also for all the mess that the Byzantines had objectively done against the papacy for no reason whatsoever. At least, there are reasons, but the wrong ones. It's considering all the disastrous, heretical mess that the Byzantines at some point tried to impose during the early Middle Ages to try to save their eastern provinces and other weird stuff like the iconoclasm, was just pillaging the rich monasteries of the French, like mostly southern Italy, that were all very connected with the papacy at the time. So you have this vicious competition next to the cooperation. There is no doubt that paradoxically there was at this point a much better relation, even during the investiture controversy, with the Western Empire and the papacy than with the Byzantine. This was true from quite a while, like from Louis the Pious. There was no doubt that the Pope was within the Carolingian Empire, at least as far as the, again, unearthly possessions of the church happened to lay on our material. The crucial aspect for which we also historiographically define the investiture controversy is literally the prohibition of the lay investiture. In other words, like, nobody should invest a bishop or any other clergyman outside the church, unless, and this is also how, of course, part of the compromise with the empire would happen, is that naturally there were some temporalia that, and I made a video specifically about this, and Henry V's sort of attempt of compromise with the church by the times of Worms, and this is, like, you can check this video out, but the recognition of those temporalia only after that bishop had been invested by the Pope, right? And there were ways of doing this. At some point there would be also a territorial difference for which the Pope would invest, like bishops in Italy. The Emperor could do the same in Germany, but of course they would do both for the same guy, the pastoral and the ring. So again, church and empire would never disconfess one another. As such, there was always the double investiture. The problem was, like, would it make the first one, and so the one that would make the guy be in office in the first place. Then you could be recognized by the other authority, but that was secondary in importance. So Gregory enacted properly the most radical legislation in this sense. So his action is remarkably powerful in a political sense, not much in the content. Again, the guy was gigantic. He was also he had a very harsh character, telling the truth. He was like the sort of Tuscan, he emerged from that temper of sort of hermeticism, of that kind of rigoristic view of how, in fact, matters had to be ordained. We've seen it in Peter Damian, etc. There's all a central Italian bias to that we'll have to investigate more at some point. And so for 40 years, for over 40 years, his struggle was continued later on until Worms, because the church, the other popes, recognized, of course, what had come with this courage of standing the ground against the emperor, observing that there was enough support to continue the same resistance and even getting ever more power in the process, right, which was fantastic. Gregory was, however, simply implementing a reform which, again, had already been outlined ideologically, as we've seen by especially the aforementioned Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida in his 3 books against the simoniacs. That is really Gregory's point of reference. There was staunch declaration of the falsity of the assumption that an emperor could be just like the head of the church, or any church for that matter, now especially that was becoming one, like controlled by Rome herself. Again, I will not digress on the reasons why Christianity had come to this immediate distinction between state and church, that people for some reason think it's just a contemporary thing, a post-enlightenment thing. The church by definition has always been separated from the state, otherwise there would have not been a church, right? To me, this is very different from Islam, for example, and it is very different from what had occurred before Christianity. As we were saying before, like more authoritarian and sort of more sclerotic systems as they would come to be internally, like the Byzantine Empire, and in part that had inspired in part the Ottonians and the Salians, would try to maintain the Caesar-papistic ideal of the Sebastocrator, so literally an Augustan, a divinely ordained authority over the church, right? The Gregorians were saying, no, this is not the case. You're a mere layman, like pretty much everyone. This is not to say that that you do not have an authority that can't be recognized by the church, because again, the church's duty is to support, to comfort, to assist the emperor, and vice versa. Just they do different things, but in concert. And it's the layman that has to conform himself to Christ's example. And since the Roman Pope is Christ's vicar on earth, by definition, and this was true since, Saint Peter, literally, there wasn't much else to do but for the emperor to adequate to the papal's will. This was essentially the Gregorian view, because there had to be a check on the, let's say, the development, on rule, right? And if the Pope had been silent in front of the misdeeds of the emperors, essentially he would have come less to his mission. The empire could have been going on, but to the detriment at that point of the same. And so actually the way to keep a strong empire was to have a strong papacy challenging him. This is very important neurobiologically speaking. It's just like a couple, right? Man and woman. There was the metaphor of sun and the moon, as you know, also from Dante Alighieri, etc., that are meant to challenge one another, are meant to be opposite, even conflictual to some point, because if they don't, they can't grow together as one, and that's the entire point of it all. In history, the empire had failed to provide that moral superiority, reason for which the Roman Empire had disgregated itself, and now it wasn't as powerful. Like it had survived, but it wasn't as powerful and united. And the church had, in that sense, a quite important moral standard to settle in order to revive the same imperial strength. And I think it is a very coherent view. It's probably the Catholic one. It's the one that also explains why Christianity came about in the first place. And again, I will discuss this in other videos that partly already done recently. And it is the one that eventually won, because the Gregorian reforms won. The Concordat of Worms essentially established that. It's not that issues were over, but fundamentally that's what would maintain until Napoleon the standard, at least of the two universal authorities. Then we lost one with secularization. The papacy is still existing. There is letter of Pope Hildebrand of Savannah, Gregory VII, to the Bishop Hermann of Metz, which sort of admonishes the emperor, and triggering a bit the reaction of the aforementioned Sigebert of Jean Bleu, and other fellow imperials that were quite reactionary in front of Gregory's innovations, and would denounce his means, and especially what had been happening in the empire, in the Western Christendom, with the war had broken out, and so on. Even this conflictuality was not new, nor there was such a thing like a feudal curia of sort. While it is true that Latin Germanic Europe was fastly accelerating in the affirmation of feudal states, the papacy maintained, like there were also feudal means of control, of course, but especially within like the papal patrimony. But the way the church came to be organized was actually a much more concentrated system, and however also than feudalism, but also a much more sparse one. Here we have to think about literally a papal monarchy that has the capacity to encompass by and succeeding in it through legitimate authority the entire Western Christendom, right? And maintaining that, which was again done successfully, which is mind-blowing when you think about it with the means of the time, and just the will and how successful this system really was for the way it had been ideated, right? There was no feudal relation also between the papacy and other states, right? When you look at the Spanish, the Hungarians, yes, there was some feudal language in the way the relations between these powers were was affirmed, but the actual connection was sort of very different in the international political function, right? And they would develop also accordingly. There wasn't even a big deal of financial reform under Gregory. Somebody started believing this, pretending that Gregory had reformed a bit everything, and so also the administrative power of the papal curia that would become really a thing later on. Think about what Honorius III achieved, right? Cardinal Cencius Savelli, right, in his time. But again, it's part of a broader development, not just strictly speaking Gregory's accomplishments. Besides, some of these had been happening already when Hildebrand was an archdeacon, for example. So it's not to say he was alien to them, but he didn't carry out the entire thing, nor it seems there is any evidence to suggest that his work in this field was decisive either, right? The reorganization of the papal curia is something that mostly strikes the observer for the 12th century, like probably at the end of the investiture controversy, and as a long-term achievement connected, by the way, to the incredible struggles that took place in these years, the various pontificates that, again, cannot be reduced just to Gregory's. Doesn't matter how important that was. You have to realize that very often the papal power was not this pontificate about Gregory that was exiled from the same Rome, as the Germans were pressuring him, and so that he fled to the Normans to die there. There was no rooting like of a permanent papal control, like on Rome, on surrounding territory. I mean, surely the papacy had his own officials, administrators, and was an effective control of many of the vast properties of the church, aside from probably the claims of essentially the entire territory, the entire Rome, for example, from Roman times, passing from public domain to literally papal possessions, etc. But the capacity of maintaining this when the city was sacked by both the Germans or the Normans at some point was, very complicated, to say the least. So you can't see that striking continuity in Gregory's times, even in those terms. Everything was still, subject to terrifying storms, right? Under Urban II, thanks to his advisors also, you start really having an innovation in papal government that would really take on that monarchic status that we are more interested in, right? So the entirety of the innovation must be crossed out, at least in the originality of Gregory's work, and especially from an intellectual or institutional point of view. Let's not downplay, of course, Gregory's contribution to it, but this is not what made him so important as he really was, right? He was just a translator, essentially, of ideas that in the 50s and in the 60s had been needed to counter the simoniacs, the married clergy, and to, say, really hit hard on the investitures of the time that were, in fact, depending on the lay authority, and so, say, disqualifying those same prelates that received their investiture. One innovation can be seen in the zeal that Gregory's Nova Concilia, that is to say, new councils, or these new, let's say, new assemblies that would declare like the unfitness of the unrightly invested prelates, which in fact were considered at this point as a mean of violent propaganda, right? One of incitation to clash against the imperial order. By the way, for example, there is a letter written to to the Saint Gregory, but by the imperial chaplain Gottschalk of Aachen, on behalf of the same Emperor Henry IV, where in January 1076, that sounds like this. It's the number 12, like in the German Middle Ages 1 section of the MGH. Subditos in prelatos armasti dum episcopos nostros spernendos doquisti dum laecis ministerium eorum super sacerdotes usurpasti, me quoque qui ad regnum sum unctus titigisti, right? Which is a pretty straightforward accusation. Henry, essentially, Gottschalk here, but on behalf of the emperor, says to Gregory that the Pope has armed let's stress this, imperial subjects, right, against prelates, those that again were had been invested by the emperor. In fact, the guy in the letter says, while as for our bishops, you have taught that they must be held in contempt, and you have unlawfully conferred their authority over priests upon laymen. Right? And by the way, you have also touched me, who have been anointed to the kingship. This is a very beautiful example of how the Salian imperial ideology considered the emperor in very, Romano-Byzantine tones, after all. I've been anointed to the kingship. I'm sacred. There's all the tradition of the holy anointing in the Frankish world, and we'll perhaps make some video to explain that better, but to say you have not only instigated violence, essentially, against my bishops, like our bishops here, it's a pluralis majestatis for the emperor, but you have literally, and we will see now what he did, because there is another letter by Gregorian instead that had literally told some laymen in Germany, we're talking about the opponents, the most powerful noblemen that would rise against Henry as he was excommunicated, to actually prevent those prelates that had been unlawfully, let's call it in this way, invested by Henry to properly carry out their office. Right, so this was a serious issue, like it was an instigation to violence, the breaking of public peace, etc. Because the emperor was excommunicated, and also the prelates in question had been unlawfully ordained, invested, more specifically, right? So what actually Gregory's pontificate stands out is this open call to the reaction against imperial rule that passes to the actual facts, right? Also violently. This would remain a constant because of the wars that naturally had been brewing, just aside from the Gregorian reforms, like against imperial authority, all the issues that had followed themselves, like the control of Italy, the problems with the elective monarchy in Germany. So many of these subjects actually had been calling for the delegitimation, I don't know, say in English, of the emperor. To some extent had been doing this, also claiming that they were finding a corrupted ruler. Everybody knew, after all, how the investitures work. Like, the system was really corrupt, but also at the time everything was really corrupt in that way. There wasn't much of another fashion to really ensure the loyalty of someone, except this had been mixing, like, the ecclesiastical with the lay, and this seemed to the papacy an incredible abuse of prerogatives that were not imperial but ecclesiastical, right? Because these guys were the church, probably in the ministry of the say. So it was a serious issue. These guys did not depend on the emperor. By the way, I made a video that speaks of the feudalization of the episcopal investitures in post-Worms Germany, which illustrates how, let's say, also the force of the emperors through this, to say, being supported by an ecclesiastical state, the same Germany sort of collapsed after the Pope, like, simply asked, like, for this regularization of the prerogatives, right? There was a duty behind all this, felt to reform the church, which was to be truly independent from bishops and kings, and on the contrary, to offer a moral guidance, when in this sense not a political one, to the latter instead. Gregory wrote, by the way, while writing to the Duke Boleslav of Poland, Christiane religiones ordo et provida dispensatio, ab his per maxime post Deum pendet, qui dominici gregis, pastores et rectores esse videntur, which illustrated essentially how it was the kings that really had to behave in a way that had to be careful in managing the same Christian religion, right? This is interesting because it's not excluding the lay authority from like the well-being of the church, right? It's actually after God, these guys that have to take care, like on earth, right, of the well-being of the church that has, in this sense, to be preserved in her independence, right? And the bishops have to be the pastors and rulers of the Lord's flock equally, right, in their complementary role to the one of also imperial guidance to an extent existed, but it was superseded by the one of Christ that the church as a whole embodied. So they would compenetrate each other, but always in a distinguished, double-threaded way, right? Gregory also instructed at the beginning of his pontificate the same Henry IV about his duty as a reformer of the church, meaning, look how you have to behave. This is also from the Registrum. It says, Regem potestatem recte te obtinere cognoscas, si regi regum Christo ad restaurationem defensionemque ecclesiarum suarum facendam dominationes tue altitudinem inclinas. Literally meaning that if you want to have like a royal power, the only way is to lean in favor of Christ, and so submit to his authority as he's the King of Kings, by the way, and restore and defend his church. So, in other words, like listen to the Roman papacy, because that's how Christ's authority comes on earth, right? And it was truly like a conviction. It was not just Gregory's one that bishops and kings, in many cases, were failing to perform their reforming duties. Which is interesting, of course, is that the reform was, as we've seen, already going on from before. So, what the program of the reform had already been laid out. Right now, you needed like the police to check whether this reform was being correctly or at all performed, right? And there are actually very beautiful quotes that refer to the observation of the entire Western Christendom from north to south. And here it's a reference from Germany to Italy, essentially. And the Pope says, like, I basically see nobody really doing their job as far as this is concerned. So this is an accusation, of course, to both the king and the bishop alike. And for this reason, the Pope had to stand up and to step in the first place. And there are quotes like cum mentis intuito partes occidentis, this is the way I was quoting, sive meridie aut septentrionis video, vix legales episcopus introitu et vita qui Christianum populum Christi amore et non seculari ambitione regent inveni. There is hardly anyone here that is doing their job other than trying to boost their own secular ambition, right? Et inter omnes seculares principes qui preponant Dei honorem suo et justitiam lucro non cognosco. Right, I don't know any, right, of these secular princes. By the way, there are truly doing anything else than aggrandizing themselves. Oportet nos quando quidem non est princeps qui Italia curet religiosorum tueri vitam. So, in other words, it's like we don't have truly anyone who is fixing this. We must step in. We have to enter and protect the lives of the religious men. And these are our men, you see, because this is the church, and so, at least as far as is that concerned, and that is so above the earthly affairs, we have the authority, we have the duty, right, the Christ-given one, to solve the problem. This is all from the Registrum. It says, cum igitur illis apostolica mandata sapernentibus, alio qualibet modo contra hec vigilare nos convenit, quibus cura dominici gregis precunctis incumbuit. Right. So, since we know that these bishops are led are astray, and that this is basically affecting the herd, right? Because this is the greatest problem. We, of whom before anyone else has the task of taking care of the Lord's flock, we should watch out against these evils by taking like some different measure from before. And this is what is setting, as we will see now, that violent path that we were taking before. And this was not anew. So what Henry was lamenting before by saying, "Oh, look at what you have done. You've inspired people against us. You've told some people to actually attack, to prevent, like our bishops, to perform their duty." Here's what Gregory had devised in a letter of January 1075, so 1 year before, in fact, the one of Henry IV, to at that point the most prominent secular supporters of the church in the Eastern Frankish kingdom. These were the Dukes Rudolf of Swabia, Berthold of Carinthia, and Welf IV of Bavaria. These were some of the most powerful provinces of Germany. Very strategic for the Franconians to cross into Italy, because along the Alpine arc, right? This means something evidently. And what it tells them is literally, "Hec eadem astricti per obedientiam tam incuria regis quam per alia loca et conventus regni notificantes ac persuadentes quantum potestis tales sacrosanctis deservire mysteris, etiam visi oportuerit prohibeatis." Right. This literally asked the aforementioned magnates, princes, to disavow the what were the unholy, in fact, orders at that point of the simoniac and married priests, right, and to basically ignore the opinions of the bishops on the subject, right. And for this, they were bound to obedience to Saint Peter, in order to make these, to put pressure properly in the king's court, in the diets of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, to highlight the issue, and when necessary, this is the most important part, exercising violence, right, when necessary, to prevent such unholy priests from administering the sacred mysteries, because the rest of the people otherwise would have paid for it unduly, and this would have damaged like the entire church, right? It's very important to stress that while historically there had been instances of true heresies stemming from the idea that the sacrament would be unworthy if performed by an unholy priest, here the Pope was not calling for it, was calling for the general glue that kept the Church together as far as the power of these mysteries was concerned. That is to say, in other words, yes, you can, if you are truly repented and contrite, etc., you can be forgiven. And so the communion, the confession was valid even when officiated by priests that had been invested by a lay authority. And so it's not that the sacraments were not valid, but overall, like the motivation of the same faithful and of the same priests to do better by the same example would have been diminished. And so as a consequence, like, souls would have been lost for the struggle against Satan in the end time. And so this could not be tolerated. This is the same, after all, principle it was from a military point of view, legitimizing the empire. Also, from the papal side, saving as many people in holy self-sacrifice in holy combat. The Church needed to inspire them, and if the Church was corrupted, there couldn't be even a victory in battle. Right? That's also why the emperor is excommunicated. At this point, the entire issue of the Gregorian reforms start taking form. There was a precise sense of duty behind all this, and this is, I think, extremely relevant. And it's surely this letter that had triggered Henry's response about, what are you telling these people to do? Like using violence, putting themselves above our own bishops, like to not allowing to officiate this, their work. Quite complicated story, as you understand, but also quite effective one. This tells you how much leverage the Pope could make on those German princes, for example, who would in fact actively fight against the Salian during his excommunication. So, as you know, the Eastern Frankish kingdom was particularly turbulent and sort of difficult to keep together in the first place. And the Gregorian reforms, in many ways, prevented even probably the affirmation of a German national monarchy. That's also why, Frederick Barbarossa was so angry against the Lombard League, sponsored by the Pope as well, because at that level, like what they had lost in this generation had not been recorded even at a lay level, where the communes, for example, had expanded and, usurped a great deal of public authority. So it was the consequences of this, again, we will discuss in other videos, but the material, the concrete damage here was enormous. So you wonder why the investiture controversy would occur in the first place. There is, in late 1075, perhaps because of, maybe not of the aforementioned Henry's scolding, because this was yet to arrive, but it was in the air evidently, in which the Pope addresses the clergy and the laity of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and he shifts sort of the attention from the simoniac and married priests to the bishops who tolerate them, rather, right? This is to be interpreted actually even as a greater, like, it's those bishops' fault. It was easier to attack the single authority that thus was, even in the criticism against mirroring the necessity of the hierarchy that the papacy now was coming to invest and say, if there is a priest that doesn't officiate like it has been invested by, a layman, like, that's an issue. But the worst one is the bishop, right? And this entailed, of course, that the same bishops, in part, had been invested in the same way. The letter is clear: is praecipimus vos nullo modo obedire vel illorum preceptis consentire. This is quite clear. Again, it creates a fracture within the same ecclesiastical hierarchy, which in part helps the same secular lay allies of the Church of Rome, because these men, especially in countries like Germany, were really like powerful, lords, right, with retinues and all, and so they were the same imperial allies, right? At this point, we will see it in some of the next videos, because I had that in store, like how also the ministeriality, for example, was so much being fostered. Like these were mostly unfree knights in the retinues of ecclesiastical princes, right? Hence why I was pointing out before that this system continues, but still the Pope wants later a control on it, and it sort of achieves part of this, at least as for Germany, the general temper that had internationally formed itself, with a true collapse in that case of an important degree of what the Germans had affirmed with great difficulty as a nascent state, really. So it was like a hell of a damage to imperial authority in the first place. The Diocese of Constance was notified that their bishop had failed to enforce the recent papal decree against clerical marriage, which was yet another issue that fostered, as we've seen, this sort of dynasticization of the church, and so the idea that those who would have, say that there would have been some families who have tended to inherit these ecclesiastical offices, and so for purposes that were not properly the one of the church and influenced by the laity as well. Here says it, as always, do not revere or obey the bishop whatsoever, which was addressed to the same vassals, like the Diocese of Constance. We've observed it in the video about medieval Swabia and others. It was really, really a powerful strategic poem in imperial policy. It says, nullam obedientiae reverentiam exhibeatis, ab omni illius subjectiones, Hugo absolvimus ita ut. So the Pope himself absolved. This is the point. Like anyone from the obedience to these guys, as well as later from the emperor with the excommunication. Like every power was nullified by what was now seen as the supreme authority of the church. Si etiam sacramenti obligationem quilibet ei fuerit obstrictus nulla ei fidelitates exhibitione fiat obnoxius. Of course, if the bishop wanted to be obeyed, he had to obey the Pope, and so he changed his condition, right? His sinful deeds. There is an intensification of the papal campaign against simony and clerical marriage, right? There is even, again, this open legitimation of the use of violence to counter these. This had to be enacted by some laymen, because the church could not use violence per se, and much of the let's say prequel to this had been seen in Milan during the Pataria. Made multiple videos on the Pataria. That is actually a very underrated event in the relations between the empire, the cities, right, of northern Italy, again, where the episcopal power had been properly endowed by the emperors with comital authority and achieving unprecedented power just by being, however, controlled by the same empire. So I don't have time now to digress on what the Pataria was in detail, but it was a sort of movement that was led by certain estates, and it was like really dividing both vertically and horizontally. Like it wasn't like a single logic behind it politically and socially, but essentially it's a sort of pre-communal struggle against this Germanic interference in the appointment of the bishops with the rise of the local knights, part of the same consular military class who would have founded the communes later, supporting certain other priests who were against this hierarchy. It's very complicated and sort of messed up, right? And there is some speculation historically. It is happening the first half of it was happening throughout the 11th century, right? But the most intense moment had been when Hildebrand of Soana was not yet pope. The speculation is that, however, at the time he had been the leading Roman supporter of the Patarine movement. It was quite radical in its foundation. There was a lot of violence going on in Milan, in the district, and again, the way this would happen was through the local knights, the local forces, saying the popular militias as well. So that there is really a lot going on in terms of the structuring of a new hierarchy, of a new power, right? And the objective was expelling, in fact, the simoniacal and married priests. Also, to depose the simoniac Archbishop of Milan. That was one of the most important prelates in the Holy Roman Empire. I made a video about Milan just recently, like an overview. We'll come back on that period because it's really, really intense, right? And you know that Saint Erlembald, a Milanese knight, is taken as an example of pious solicitude. Just to use the same words of Gregory here, I can read you in Latin. Erlembaldo, strenuissimo Christi militi, pie sollicitudinis, studio in defensione fidei, sanctaeque religionis, restauratione. Right. This comes from the Registrum, by the way, but there are lots of other sources regarding the Pataria connected with Gregory, right? And that was known, in fact, at the time as the Pope of the Patarines by his opponents, right? There was all, again, like a brutal change in the process with the traditional feudal order that in part had overlapped in the figure of the bishop count as an individual co-opted by the emperor, right, to make the area more obedient, right, to the lay authority. And that now is literally hijacked by the communes as self-determined, essentially, communities that, in fact, take enormous advantage of the victory of the papacy with the concordat of worms and essentially the evaporation of imperial authority for a couple of generations in the region to substitute themselves to the imperial authority. That's sort of a checkmate, also because the popes can avoid like emperors descending for a while. Even though it would keep happening, we've seen different reigns of the ones of Lothar III, of Conrad III, before Frederick Barbarossa, but this was a very different situation from the one of the first half of the 11th century, in which literally the emperors could simply even appoint popes and archbishops, etc. And so managing the church, it wasn't that easy as it sounds, and in part because of these early ferments. But Gregory is the pope that really gives the impulse to the right shoulder hit, like that shifts a great part of the balance, exploiting the situation. It's not that the Roman papacy liked more than much necessarily the Patarian movement, but it was just a mean to an end. Among the Patarians were also lots of heterodox people, but the Pope had to take care of that later, right? At that point, the most important thing was to survive as an independent church from earthly power, right? In here, like, there are other interesting quotes, such as the fact that there were priests in that they had to be corrected basically through the love of God, the dignity of their offices, and so they had to be corrected through an actual secular attack, right? The sense of shame, right? The world had to rebuke them. This is the phrase in one of Gregory's letters: qui pro amore Dei et officii dignitatem non corriguntur verecundia seculi et objurgatione populi respiskant. Right? This aspect is particularly crucial. Sometimes you find the distinction of secular and lay mixed up, right? Secular as an adjective is applicable to the same clergy, right? The opposite of that is lay, right? The secular clergy is literally who the priests and bishops are, right? This is the literal hierarchy of the church. They're not monks, they're not friars, other people who are essentially out there on their own and their own personal experience. This is the secular clergy because it has to deal with the world, with the parishes, with the people, with marriages, with funerals, with confessions, with everyday sins of the people. And as such, these people are public, right? Before we mentioned Peter Damian, and we observed in the video dedicated to him how this guy was a hermit that, however, was a great jurist and solving matters all over northern Italy with enormous education and high sense of lay public culture as well, but operating as a figure of point of reference for all those who wanted the church reformed, and so setting the standard and the example. This is not like a hypocrisy, right? These Gregorian reforms were meant to happen for literally safeguarding the balance, as we've seen, between the laity and the church, because they overlapped in real life, right? And so they had to be disciplined in a way that you could count on. You could set the standard that could reorder this system as Europe had been reordering itself, starting from this Latin Germanic base re-expanding, led by the Frankish Empire, the Roman papacy. We talked a lot about this topic also in the playlist about the Renovatio Imperii. What did this sense of order mean, right? And how were the people of the time really reflecting upon the same and saying, we must reset some standards if we are expanding so much, if there is ever more wealth around, if we need to expand, we have to set an order, right? We must legislate. Today we haven't seen this, but in other videos we observed how all this was going in parallel with a relentless juridical activity. Canon law and Roman law here were being rediscovered in, let's say, re-expanded, recovered, restructured in parallel, because each of these laws was disciplining both sides that were interacting with one another. In fact, this juridical development would happen largely in parallel by scale of refinement. And there could have not been even a humanism or a renaissance without this. There could have been like real states in the Middle Ages. There would have been, but they would have been more unstable because of that. See what happened in Islam normally, right? Because of the lack of a priesthood, because of the lack of a church, right? In the union of the standard, mankind was not capable of holding that, right? Since the Roman Empire, right? And the systems who did not understand this failed, and that's why the West took off, and the others wouldn't. It's a sinful condition, as it was before, just more convenient to reset the standard, and you can argue that things went fairly well. That things, after all, were fruitful, and that the Middle Ages set, like, as long as these universal authorities work, set the example as a hell of a civilization that was literally booming exactly around this time and accelerating even further. So all of this, we could just make a sum of all this. We've seen how Gregory's principles were inspired by Humbert of Silva Candida. It's a very famous cardinal that I hope to make a video on, given we talk Gregory, we talk Peter Damian. We need to really add all the pieces here to render back the full picture. All right. And how this principle was truly felt as a redemptive one, right? The fact that the secular princes and the faithful men would have to defend the reform themselves, owing that to the mother church, right, was seen as a vengeful move, right? They had to venerate and free their mother church. This is what was expressed by Humbert of Silva Candida in his work Adversus Simoniacos back in the day. It says, Demum secularis principes et fidelis laici pro defensione et recuperazione quam matri sue ecclesiae debent. Right, this is extremely important. They owed it to the mother church. Quod libere et dilecte matris not degeneres fili, cuius si pudicitiam cognoverent ab adulteris captivari nec mora cinguntur vindicaturi. Right, so this is a way of self-preservation. It's not at stake some abstract papal power of the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, or just, I don't know, the Salian monarchy based on the Rhineland, some part of Saxony and Swabia. This is about the entire Western Christendom's fate at stake. We've seen how Rome said not to Constantinople. We see how Rome here fosters a different relation with the empire, her empire, as a matter of fact. Never underestimate that connection. Never think that something ended from ancient times. The Roman Empire is there. The holiness of Rome is there, right? The Catholic tradition is there. It's all like before, and these people know that. Reason for which, of course, we could spend ourselves much more describing the metaphysical implications, in the mentality of the time, and in how much people felt this duty, right? But first and foremost, it's important also to assess literally the words that we've been seeing a bit today. The mass boycottage of the erring priests is something that Gregory did not invent, was already there, shamed the secular clergy that is invalidating, in a sense, the same sacraments. Humbert had gone so far, and this was hotly debated before I said, the Roman Church did not go astray, for that matter, in a theological sense, but the political aftershock of this was even of just these wars was insane, right? It was something that could be hardly unseen, and felt like, for the aforementioned issue, if I have to receive the sacraments from this priest, what does this mean at all? Yes, the sacrament is valid, but do I trust this person? How do I relate myself with it, right? Can I do better? Can I stand up against a clergyman that has compromised his morality with just the this interest for which it had been simply invested for personal gain or whatever. It's a thin line, in some circumstances. It's not to say that every clergyman that was invested by a lay authority was a bad person, or they were doing it as incompetence, or that there was something after all, more wrong in some ways that things were carried out normally within the same Roman Church. This is about the principle. This is about the truth. This is what you stand for as a general repetition of the universal spirituality, and the erosion of universal authority passes through the disintegration of the same essence of the two souls that existed within, right? And that the empire had, say, the Catholic, the world, like the real world had split in two offices that had to be however keep cooperating in order to keep the system going. And if you undermine one, the other would have suffered all of it. And I think this is self-evident even before the Gregorian reforms, because as you understand, both sides were being weakened by this. There wasn't like a coherent like ecclesiastical unity as like the one that would emerge after the reform, nor there was actually a functional solid empire before that, at least. And let's say there is, even in the final shortcoming of, say, of the two, well, they fall, like, let's say, Germany had this other problems, as we're saying, so they're not really directly comparable. In part, yes, like it's it can be seen as a form of this, but the role of the church, never forget that, was also resting on not just the Holy Roman Empire, but say on France and England and other powers that would be become like cooperative with the church, and so have their own part of the imperium that the emperor at that point didn't have. Yes, you're Holy Roman Emperor, but you factually control just some parts of Germany and Italy. What about the French? What about the English? Like, God has given them an imperium evidently. Where are you there? The church manages to achieve an unprecedented level of cohesion because other powers also support her within the Western Christendom. So on the wake of the historical prestige that Rome had and the early connection of this broader world under the fact imperial and ecclesiastical cooperation that had been going on arguably since the beginning of the church, there is no doubt. So this is why it's important to study these topics, why they're always relevant, and I hope that we will be covering them soon. Again, for today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.